Hello, you are listening to the Anti-Marketing Podcast, where I explore what it really means to throw the marketing rulebook out of the window. If you're a rebellious explorer, adventurer, or changemaker, then this is the podcast for you. The Anti-Marketing Podcast is hosted by me, Julian. I'm the founder of Off the Rock Media and a fellow maverick. I'm delighted that you're here, so sit back, hold tight, and let's dive in. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Anti-Marketing Podcast. Today's episode is called A Life Between the Lines. I want to start with a bit of honesty. In truth, I had no idea what I was going to discuss in this week's episode until yesterday. During the last episode, I discussed at length dreams and archetypes and how they relate to marketing and storytelling. To be frank, I felt that it hadn't quite hit the mark, and I feel that it may have inadvertently come across as a little self-indulgent. As such, I really thought that a rethink was needed. But the more I thought about it, the less inspired I became. But as luck would have it, a client asked me a very insightful question yesterday, which of course has now been crafted into this podcast episode. Therefore, I make no apology for this TED Talk. As I said, a client yesterday asked me a question. He asked me specifically if my marketing business, Off the Rock Media, would just be a part-time thing once I started my Masters in Mental Health Psychology at the University of Edinburgh. At first, I was stumped and didn't really know how to answer him. In fact, the question seemed to raise more questions for me than answers. It made me think more deeply about the way that I am perceived by others. Currently, it feels like I'm spinning three relatively large plates. I'm a marketer, a developing singer, and I will shortly become a postgraduate psychology student. I say this not to complain, but to offer some context. On the face of it, I could see that publicly these personas could seem confusing for some people. And I can see that it isn't entirely clear, A, who I am, or B, which path I am pursuing. However, my career has always been characterised by many converging paths, but can so often be evaluated as a step-by-step logical progression that should have a particular destination. I have never viewed choosing one career path as a requirement for me, but instead view my career as the emergence of increasing levels of intellectual curiosity and technical skill across several seemingly separate but interconnected disciplines. In short, the blurring of disciplines is a skill I seem to have developed with increasing skill and with often hugely rewarding results. It is a skill that I believe is necessary, especially in our fast-paced and ever-changing world. I do understand why this client asked me the question, and I remain grateful to have had the chance to reflect on it more deeply. I hope that by providing this deep dive, I can reach out to my audience and provide some much needed camaraderie to my fellow non-linear life path colleagues. A moment that really sticks out for me in considering how I understand my own career path was a few months ago, when I sent my mum a meme about how disappointing it was to discover that you couldn't be a writer, psychologist and actor all in one lifetime. And while for me, the idea that one person could give 100% to each remains virtually impossible at present, I do also reject the idea that we should be characterised by one particular label within our respective careers that misses the nuance and the complexity of our life and work in modern times. I often think of teachers as a perfect example of multidisciplinary professionals. On one hand, they do teach and so are called teachers, but on the other hand, they are asked to be locum parent, to be social worker, first aider, and lots of other things too. We live in a world that demands certainty and security, but also asks us to be curious, to broaden our horizons, and to explore our options. This, in my mind at least, creates a really interesting juxtaposition. Whilst the limiting roles we ascribe our own and others' careers can serve to increase our financial security and social standing, We are also offered an opportunity to experiment, combine and explore options and try various opportunities on for size. It is a tension that I don't think will be easily resolved until we leave rigid thinking behind and recognise the complexities and nuances that accompany modern professional life. For me, those tensions really began to appear after some personal tragedies pushed me beyond the edges of my comfort zone and across to the other side of the world. Towards the end of 2017, I ended up backpacking in Australia and New Zealand. I was on a shoestring budget and I had no idea what I was doing. But I did start to build the foundations of a somewhat hashed together career that has emerged before me today. Specifically, it was in a Melbourne library at a free Photoshop workshop that I first discovered my love of digital marketing. And while I've never been a painter or any type of visual artist, I did discover a love for digital design, which is a skill I have worked hard to hone ever since. This experience also planted a seed which has paid dividends since, and has, through many twists and turns, resulted in the airing of this podcast today. Recording this truly does feel like a full circle moment. But that trip wasn't at all glamorous. It was indeed full of anxiety, financial strain, and a lot of uncertainty. But it taught me skills in survival and resilience in the face of financial hardship and also loneliness. Few discuss the trials and tribulations of solo travelling within the travel industry. Instead, a hopeful narrative centred on fantastical notions of self-discovery and the promise of aquamarine shores, golden coastlines and stunning sunsets are pushed by savvy marketers on young, easy-to-exploit youth. Not to sound disparaging of the industry, but to me the fantasy often seemed the exception rather than the rule. Whilst it could be argued that this kind of marketing is purpose-led in form, it is not so in spirit. Marketing that is disingenuous, exploits a certain demographic and does not reach out across psychographic divides, especially within a more socially conscious world, will not win the day. I am not saying that in between my own moments of struggle whilst travelling, there weren't moments of real joy. There were moments that I will never forget, such as having the chance to photograph the Australian national rugby team during the Melbourne Cup, cheering at Sydney Mardi Gras as Cher led the parade, or falling in love with Delta Goodrem whilst being part of the live studio audience on The Voice Australia. What I am saying, however, is that those experiences were organic and emergent. They were not planned. These experiences taught me how several seemingly opposing things can be true. Namely, that it is possible to feel both lonely and awestruck, and anxious about finances, and grateful for the little that I did have, all at the same time. These seemingly opposing truisms are perhaps some of the most poignant lessons I have learned to date. Purpose-led brands would do well to take note of these points. In becoming more socially conscious, audiences seek genuine authenticity, and that, I believe, requires a complete rethink of the stories we tell, not only to ourselves, but about our brands and what they can offer. Emotional resonance, then, I believe, is key for purpose-led brands. Looking back, I can see that 3 themes characterised that period of my life. Those were music, marketing, and psychology. It would be several years later before I saw their collective significance, and with each of them in their own way, offering a healing and a sanctuary for me during some very difficult seasons of my life. So when I think about how I position my own career, both in my mind and that of others, I need to remember that it has never really been about chasing a title or a career path, but about recognising that life is complex, messy, and interconnected. In a similar way, the stories purpose-led brands tell also need to reflect the complexity, messiness, and interconnectedness of life. Purpose-led brands, therefore, need to capture the mood of the day, whilst keeping an eye on the ideals of tomorrow and the nostalgia of yesterday. They need to position themselves alongside the people they serve. It is through this lens, then, that I view my own career path and why I am so passionate about supporting these brands. I do not believe for a minute that my journey is, nor should be, a model for how anyone else should live their life. However, I do believe that there are many within the business community who often feel boxed in, feeling pressure to conform to a prescribed way of doing things. It is often a great source of joy when I meet founders who reject these notions. The prevailing narrative within society has tended towards a need for us to choose one thing, one identity and one path, and stick to it. My experience says quite the opposite. There really is no wrong path. I've had the chance to work with, meet and be in the presence of some incredibly powerful, successful and influential people, including MSPs, CEOs, leading academics and thought leaders. None of these individuals' lives appeared to be predestined, however. Whilst I do not wish to delve into the furore of current political discourse in this episode, it is notable that the life of Scotland's first female First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, never seemed to be guaranteed. I have recently finished listening to her memoir, Frankly. Having met Miss Sturgeon on more than one occasion, in both political and non-political settings, I remain struck not only by the humanness and compassion that she reflects in the face of brutal opposition and misogyny, but also by her conviction that her life course wasn't necessarily inevitable. Here, one of the most formidable politicians of the 21st century doesn't appear to have had a plan and didn't choose one particular path, but by using her instincts, she followed opportunities that emerged before her. A lack of a plan, it would seem, may well be one of the key ingredients to success. But I think it is truer to say that even the best laid plans carry people to very different destinations to the one they might have originally intended. It is my hope, therefore, that this podcast can serve as a space where we can ditch the notion of a linear, predestined life course and instead share our experiences and tell the stories that have shaped us. In so doing, I hope to grow alongside you and hope that together we can become a little bit more purpose-led and emergent in our thinking and in our leadership. I hope we can learn from each other and give ourselves permission to live multidimensional and interdisciplinary lives. So, as this community grows, I'd love to hear from you. What are the different, seemingly opposing threads of your own story? How do you weave together these parts of yourself that others might see as contradictory, but that you suspect are deeply connected? You can reach out to me on socials or through my website. I'll drop the links in the caption to this episode. I've spoken to thousands of people who are longing to build a more purpose-led life, but don't know where to begin. I argue that such change begins with us. I hope that is subsequently expressed through this community of purpose-led changemakers that I am seeking to build. You've been listening to the Anti-Marketing Podcast with me, Julian from Off The Rock Media, where I've been exploring what it means to really throw the marketing rulebook out of the window. If you or your brand are a rebellious explorer, adventurer or changemaker, then I'd love to hear from you and to explore whether we would be a right fit for you to appear as a guest on this podcast. If you think that you and your brand are a good fit, please send me an email at hello@offtherockmedia.co.uk and I'll be back in touch with you as soon as possible. I look forward to hearing from you. Stay tuned and see you next week.